A rusted iron collar clamped tightly around a man's neck in the Marshalsea prison. For 14 days and nights, he was chained upright against a stone pillar. His hands were bound behind his back, leaving him standing in his own waste. If he dropped his head from exhaustion, the iron collar would instantly choke him. This torment stood in stark contrast to the first half of his life. Sebastian Newdigate was born into nobility, served as a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, and was a close confidant of King Henry VIII. He willingly renounced his royal privileges to become a cloistered monk. However, his unwavering commitment to his faith ultimately led the very king he once served to sentence him to death. Born in 1500, Sebastian was the product of the deeply entrenched English land-owning elite. His father, John Newdigate, operated as a powerful, massively capitalized squire in Harefield, Middlesex. This socio-economic classification provided the Newdigate family with significant regional influence, generating the financial surplus necessary to invest heavily in the education and intellectual development of their offspring. Sebastian was extracted from the provincial environment and inserted into the prestigious halls of Cambridge University. In the early 16th century, the university curriculum was not designed merely to produce clerics. It was a training ground for the administrative and diplomatic personnel required by the central state. Sebastian was subjected to rigorous training in classical philosophy, rigidly structured theology, and the complex rhetorical mechanics necessary to navigate the highest echelons of European society. This specific educational background, fusing unassailable aristocratic pedigree with a highly disciplined, scholastically sharpened intellect, engineered the optimal profile for integration into the Tudor court. He possessed the physical bearing of a nobleman and the analytical capacity of a theologian. By the 1520s, this profile successfully propelled him into the absolute epicenter of the English political hurricane, Whitehall and Hampton Court. Upon his integration into the royal court, Sebastian Newdigate was appointed as a gentleman of the Privy Chamber to King Henry VIII. The immense administrative weight of this appointment entirely defies modern conceptions of institutional government. In the political environment of the 1520s, Tudor state, true political authority did not reside within the geographic confines of parliamentary chambers, nor was it distributed among bureaucratic agencies. Power was highly centralized, autocratic, and deeply personal. It emanated exclusively from the physical body of the monarch. Consequently, political influence was measured by a single definitive metric: physical proximity to the king's person. The Privy Chamber was not an administrative office. It was the innermost sanctum of the royal apartments, an exclusionary zone heavily guarded against the vast majority of the nobility. The gentlemen of the Privy Chamber were the designated personnel authorized to breach this perimeter. Their duties were not clerical. Sebastian Newdigate and his colleagues managed the king's immediate physical environment. They assisted the monarch in dressing, physically handling the royal garments. They managed his diet, attended to his personal hygiene, and controlled the immediate private quarters during his most vulnerable hours of rest. This level of physical access transformed the gentlemen of the Privy Chamber into the most powerful gatekeepers of information in the kingdom. Ambassadors, high-ranking bishops, and powerful regional lords recognized that to transmit documentation or requests to the king, they had to bypass or secure the favor of the men who physically guarded the door to his bedchamber. Sebastian Newdigate held the capacity to filter the intelligence reaching the sovereign, effectively shaping the administrative reality of the state. The relationship between the king and the gentlemen of the Privy Chamber extended far beyond administrative facilitation. It required an intensely complex, deeply psychological symbiosis. Henry VIII, in his early 30s, possessed a fiercely aggressive, intensely athletic body. The personnel operating within his immediate presence were required to mirror and actively engage with this physicality. Sebastian Newdigate did not merely stand adjacent to the throne. He actively participated in the martial and recreational activities that defined the king's psychology. He was required to ride alongside Henry in the vast royal reserves, executing high-speed, dangerous pursuits of deer and wild boar. He participated in the violent, high-stakes equestrian jousting tournaments that functioned as the primary mechanism for demonstrating martial capability within the court. This continuous, exceptionally physical interaction forged an intense, deeply intimate bond between the monarch and his courtier. Sebastian observed the unvarnished reality of the autocrat. He witnessed the king's physical vulnerabilities, his unguarded emotional volatility, and the raw mechanics of his ambition before they were sanitized for public consumption. However, the core reality of an autocratic regime dictates that maintaining physical intimacy with the sovereign is the most dangerous position within the state. To stand adjacent to a monarch who possesses the unilateral authority to strip a man of his titles, seize his territorial assets, or order his execution requires total, unyielding loyalty. The gentlemen of the Privy Chamber were expected to function as flawlessly polished mirrors, perfectly reflecting the king's desires, validating his intelligence, and enthusiastically endorsing his administrative decisions. Sebastian Newdigate had successfully navigated this psychological hazard throughout the 1520s, securing his position as an untouchable figure within the Tudor hierarchy. He possessed the king's trust, the requisite physical capabilities, and the intellectual refinement to maintain his proximity. He occupied a position of total security, provided he maintained his compliance. Yet, the educational infrastructure that had propelled Sebastian into the Privy Chamber contained deep religious convictions that were incompatible with total submission. His time at Cambridge had instilled in him an unyielding, deeply rooted adherence to traditional Catholic theology and natural law. He possessed a rigid internal metric for morality that operated entirely independent of state directives. As the geopolitical priorities of King Henry VIII began to radically shift, transitioning from maintaining international alliances to securing a need for a male heir at any cost, the political demands placed upon the Privy Chamber fundamentally altered. The monarch's evolving political agenda would soon initiate a massive, kingdom-altering legislative rupture. This rupture would force Sebastian Newdigate to calculate the exact fatal intersection between his unwavering faith and his external obligation to the autocrat he served. The exceptionally functional, physically intimate symbiosis between Sebastian Newdigate and King Henry VIII functioned flawlessly as long as the state's objectives remained aligned with established geopolitical norms. However, the absolute foundation of the entire Tudor court was intrinsically predicated on a single reproductive necessity, the production of a viable male heir to secure the dynastic succession. When this objective failed, the resulting administrative crisis triggered a systemic rupture that completely dismantled the moral and legal infrastructure of the English state. This crisis, historically designated as the King's Great Matter, forced every operative within the Tudor hierarchy to calculate their exact threshold for ideological compliance. For Sebastian Newdigate, occupying the absolute epicenter of the Privy Chamber, this crisis transitioned from a macro-political event into a deeply personal theological conflict, ultimately resulting in his total withdrawal from the royal court. By the mid-1520s, the undeniable physical aging and reproductive limitations of Queen Catherine of Aragon became a severe, insurmountable logistical impediment for the central government. She had passed the threshold of reproductive viability without securing a surviving male heir. In the fiercely insecure, heavily contested political environment of 16th century monarchy, a female succession was perceived not merely as a disadvantage, but as an existential threat to the state, virtually guaranteeing a return to the catastrophic civil warfare that had defined the previous century. To neutralize this threat, King Henry VIII initiated a protocol to legally invalidate his marriage of over 20 years and elevate a young, strategically positioned courtier, Anne Boleyn. This maneuver was not a standard diplomatic divorce, because the marriage to Catherine had been secured through specific papal dispensations. Invalidating it required Henry VIII to effectively dismantle a millennium of established ecclesiastical jurisprudence. When the Vatican refused to authorize the annulment, the king made the unprecedented decision to legally sever the entire English state from the jurisdiction of Rome. He initiated a legislative mutation that would consolidate absolute spiritual and temporal authority directly into the physical body of the monarch. From his privileged position within the Privy Chamber, Sebastian Newdigate was forced to observe the exact, unvarnished mechanics of this institutional overhaul. He did not witness a measured theological debate. He witnessed the rapid, systemic collapse of aristocratic and ecclesiastical integrity. The Tudor court immediately polarized. However, in an autocratic regime, survival dictates that the polarization must rapidly transition into absolute, vocal consensus. Sebastian observed the highest-ranking personnel in the kingdom, dukes, earls, and senior bishops, who had previously sworn holy, binding oaths of fealty to Queen Catherine, systematically execute a coldly calculated moral capitulation. These individuals recognized that opposing the king's new directive or challenging the elevation of Anne Boleyn would result in the immediate revocation of their territorial assets, their administrative influence, and potentially the violent termination of their own mortal lives. Consequently, the court devolved into a cutthroat, fiercely competitive environment of required sycophancy. The English elite eagerly bent the knee, effectively trading their long-standing legal and religious oaths for continued proximity to the king and the promise of newly confiscated wealth. For Sebastian Newdigate, this environment of mandatory validation presented an absolute moral impasse. His deeply rooted adherence to traditional Catholic theology made any compromise impossible, as his faith provided a strict framework regarding the sanctity of oaths, the jurisdiction of the universal church, and the bounds of natural law. He was fundamentally incapable of reconciling the actions of the sovereign with his own conscience. He recognized that the king was actively subjugating universally established religious doctrine, entirely to satisfy an immediate dynastic necessity for a male heir alongside his own raw personal desire However, operating within the highly restricted zone of the king's private apartments, open defiance was strategically impossible. To verbally challenge Henry VIII's legislative agenda while dressing him or attending to his meals would be classified as an immediate act of treason, resulting in swift execution. Therefore, Sebastian initiated a strategy of silent non-compliance. He ceased his active participation in the newly mandated social protocols of the court. He systematically absented himself from the prominent, wildly lavish state banquets and specific celebrations designed to validate the ascension of Anne Boleyn. He attempted to utilize physical absence to maintain his theological integrity without actively triggering the state's expanding network of spies. This strategy contained a fatal miscalculation. In a rapidly tightening autocratic system, neutrality is functionally non-existent. A regime engaged in a fiercely controversial, legally dubious centralization of power requires constant active validation from its personnel. The absence of applause is immediately registered by the state as a hostile metric. The king, operating under increasing paranoia regarding his own legitimacy, inevitably detected the physical absence and the silent withdrawal of his intimate confidant. Recognizing that the environment of Whitehall Palace had become an acutely dangerous environment of political survival and moral degradation, Sebastian Newdigate executed an unprecedented maneuver. Around 1524, he initiated a total voluntary extraction from the English socio-political hierarchy. He did not merely request a transfer to a provincial estate or seek a diplomatic posting abroad. He systematically surrendered his entire accumulated socioeconomic capital. He formally resigned his commission within the Privy Chamber, permanently revoking his access to the sovereign. He discarded the high-status textiles, the furs and imported silks that visually designated his aristocratic rank. He abandoned the immense wealth and regional influence generated by the Newdigate family estate in Middlesex. He walked away from the epicenter of European power to subject himself to the most severe protocol of physical and spiritual discipline available within the English realm. He sought immediate asylum at the London Charterhouse. The London Charterhouse, situated just beyond the densely populated, chaotic urban center of the capital, was a monastery operated by the Carthusian order. The absolute severity of Sebastian's transition becomes undeniably clear only when examining the specific unforgiving rules of the Carthusian rule. It was universally recognized as the strictest, most grueling, and ruthlessly unforgiving monastic system in the country. The transition from the Privy Chamber to the Charterhouse represented an absolute inversion of environmental stimuli. The royal court was defined by extreme sensory overload, continuous high-stakes social interaction, and maximum indulgence in lavish banquets. The Charterhouse was engineered specifically to impose absolute sensory deprivation, strict spatial isolation, and continuous physical deprivation. Upon his acceptance into the order, Sebastian's aristocratic identity was systematically erased. He submitted to the tonsure, the shaving of the head that visually standardized the personnel. The physical architecture of the monastery was designed to prevent social aggregation. Rather than living in communal dormitories, each Carthusian monk was assigned an individual, strictly isolated stone cell. Sebastian was required to spend the vast majority of his diurnal and nocturnal cycles confined entirely within this restricted cell, dedicating his mind exclusively to solitary prayer and theological study. The Carthusian rule did not merely restrict spatial mobility, It aggressively targeted the physical comfort of the body. The high-status textiles Sebastian previously wore were replaced by a rigidly specific standardized uniform deliberately designed to inflict continuous tactile distress. He was required to wear a hair shirt, a garment woven from coarse animal hair worn directly against the epidermis. This garment was engineered to chafe the skin continuously, generating a permanent low-level state of physical discomfort, thereby preventing the body from achieving a state of rest and forcing his mind away from earthly comforts. Furthermore, the order enforced a strictly regulated protocol of dietary restriction. The Carthusians were strict vegetarians, permanently denying themselves the high-protein meat consumption that was a primary status marker of the Tudor nobility. This baseline diet was frequently interrupted by punishing prolonged fasts designed to systematically weaken the physical frame, subjugating the physical requirements of the body to the spiritual needs of the mind. He slept on a rigid, unpadded wooden plank, further minimizing physical recovery. Most significantly, the order operated under a vow of near total silence. Speaking was strictly prohibited, permitted only during brief, strictly regulated intervals for necessary logistical coordination or communal chanting. Sebastian transitioned from an environment defined by constant, high-stakes verbal negotiation to an environment of absolute silence. Sebastian Newdigate believed that by burying his identity within the silent, impenetrable stone walls of the Charterhouse, and by subjecting his body to extreme physical deprivation, he could effectively sever himself from the political purges brewing in the capital. He calculated that geographic and social withdrawal would equate to political neutrality in the eyes of the state. He sought only to utilize his isolated existence to pray for the theological stability of the nation. This calculation represented a profound misunderstanding of the Tudor government's assessment of moral influence as a threat. In a fiercely insecure, newly established autocratic regime, the state cannot tolerate the existence of an independent, unassimilated moral authority. The London Charterhouse was not an obscure, forgotten institution. It operated as a prominently visible, deeply revered spiritual beacon for the civilian population of London. The civilian demographic universally respected the extreme discipline and unyielding sanctity of the Carthusian monks, because the monks possessed this massive, undeniable moral capital. Their silence regarding the king's new legislative agenda was not perceived by the central government as a peaceful withdrawal. It was registered as a deafening, intensely dangerous, and structurally subversive protest. King Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell recognized a critical logistical reality. If the most holy, highly respected men in the kingdom did not publicly validate the new theological architecture of the state, the civilian population would never fully accept the legitimacy of the king's supremacy or the validity of Queen Anne Boleyn. By retreating to the Charterhouse, Sebastian Newdigate had not escaped the political hurricane. He had unknowingly positioned himself directly inside the primary target zone of the state's newly modernized legal weaponry. The central government was preparing to enforce total ideological conformity, and the blatantly visible silence of the Carthusians was about to be reclassified from a theological practice into a capital offense. The voluntary extraction of Sebastian Newdigate into the severely restrictive, isolated environment of the London Charterhouse operated on an isolated assumption that geographical withdrawal from the political epicenter would guarantee immunity from the state's shifting ideological directives. This assumption was fundamentally invalidated by the central government's subsequent actions. Between 1534 and 1535, the Tudor administrative apparatus, engineered primarily by the king's chief minister Thomas Cromwell, executed a massive jurisprudential revolution. This legal overhaul did not merely alter the geopolitical alignment of the English state, it entirely redefined the fundamental definitions of citizenship, loyalty, and crime. The state systematically expanded its jurisdiction, moving beyond the regulation of physical actions to claim absolute authority over the internal thoughts and spiritual beliefs of its people. To secure the fiercely controversial, legally engineered succession of Queen Anne Boleyn, and to formalize the break with the Roman Catholic Church, the Tudor government recognized that military force and standard legislative decrees were insufficient. The state required a mechanism to identify, isolate, and neutralize ideological dissent before it could manifest as physical rebellion. The logistical solution was the mandated extraction of a formalized oath. Following the passage of the Act of Succession in early 1534, the central government deployed royal commissioners across the realm. These operatives were authorized to demand that every adult male, specifically targeting the nobility, the administrative bureaucracy, and the ecclesiastical hierarchy, sign a standardized legal document. The document demanded absolute compliance with two non-negotiable parameters. First, the signatory had to legally recognize the complete invalidity of the king's previous marriage to Catherine of Aragon, thereby confirming the bastardization of her daughter. Second, and infinitely more disruptive to the established theological order, the signatory was required to affirm King Henry VIII as the supreme head of the Church of England, explicitly rejecting all external papal jurisdiction. For the personnel operating within the secular government, this oath was a standard political transaction, trading a signature for continued state patronage and personal safety. For the personnel operating within the rigorous parameters of traditional Catholic theology, such as the Carthusian monks, the oath represented an absolute violation of natural law and a formalized submission of eternal spiritual authority to a temporal, dangerously volatile autocrat. The imposition of the oath was immediately fortified by the passage of the Treason Act of 1534. A forensic analysis of this specific legislation reveals it as one of the most severe, ruthlessly modernized instruments of state control deployed in the 16th century. Prior to this act, the legal classification of high treason under English common law required a demonstrable, overt physical action. The state had to prove that a subject had actively levied war against the monarch, counterfeited the royal currency, or engaged in an actionable physical conspiracy to assassinate the sovereign. Thomas Cromwell's 1534 legislation fundamentally mutated this legal paradigm. The new statute criminalized the internal thoughts of the subject. It established that any individual who maliciously wished, willed, or desired by words or writing to deprive the king of his titles, including his newly fabricated title as supreme head of the church, was guilty of high treason. The immediate operational effect of this legislation was the weaponization of language and the criminalization of silence. If a royal commissioner presented a subject with the oath and the subject refused to vocalize their assent or simply remained silent, the state legally interpreted that silence as a malicious imagination against the crown. The Tudor legal machine had successfully established absolute jurisdiction over the human mind. The failure to actively and enthusiastically validate the king's ego was now a capital offense punishable by total execution. Because the Carthusian monks possessed immense, unassailable moral capital among the civilian population of London, the central government prioritized their immediate capitulation. The state recognized that if the Charterhouse refused the oath, their blatantly visible noncompliance would function as a contained anchor for widespread ideological resistance. In May 1534, royal commissioners breached the sanctuary of the Charterhouse. They interrupted the strictly regulated silence of the monastery, assembling the priors and the monks, including Sebastian Newdigate, to demand immediate mental and verbal submission to the new legislative reality. The initial interaction was defined by a complex theological negotiation. The prior of the Charterhouse, John Houghton, attempted a strategy of direct appeasement. He argued that the monks were dead to the secular world, entirely divorced from the politics of the king's marriage, and requested exemption from engaging with state legislation. The commissioners rejected this defense, recognizing that granting an exemption would immediately invalidate the absolute authority of the statute. Under extreme duress and following a brief imprisonment of the priors, the Carthusians initially agreed to swear a heavily modified version of the oath, adding the specific legal caveat, "as far as the law of God permits." The state temporarily accepted this qualified submission to avoid an immediate public execution of deeply revered holy men. However, an autocratic system operating on the absolute ideological conformity of its subjects cannot tolerate qualified submission. The central government requires absolute unconditioned validation. By early 1535, following the formal implementation of the Act of Supremacy, the state returned to the Charterhouse. This secondary operation was designed to eliminate the theological loopholes. The commissioners presented an updated, uncompromising oath. There would be no caveats, no theological conditions, and no recognition of natural law. The monks were ordered to explicitly, verbally, and physically sign a document confirming Henry VIII as the absolute, unquestioned spiritual authority in England. For Sebastian Newdigate, John Houghton, William Exmew, and Humphrey Middlemore, this demand breached the absolute threshold of their unwavering faith. They possessed a rigidly structured, unyielding understanding of papal authority and the eternal nature of the sacraments. They recognized that signing the unconditional oath was not a political maneuver. It was the deliberate, formalized severing of their own souls from the universal church. Operating under the strict parameters of their conscience, they initiated an absolute refusal. They declined to vocalize the required affirmations and refused to apply their signatures to the state documentation. They utilized the only mechanism of defense available to them within the Carthusian rule: total, unyielding silence. The refusal of the Carthusians to validate the state apparatus generated a massive administrative crisis for Thomas Cromwell, but it triggered a profoundly personal, deeply emotional, psychological rupture within King Henry VIII. The extreme severity of the Crown's subsequent retaliatory protocols was directly rooted in the king's specific, highly intimate personal relationship with Sebastian Newdigate. This was not a standardized interaction between a monarch and an anonymous, disobedient provincial cleric. This was an intensely targeted rejection executed by a former intimate confidant. Henry VIII had previously shared his private sanctuaries, his physical vulnerabilities, and his recreational environments with Sebastian. He had allowed the man to dress him and manage his immediate surroundings. From the perspective of the autocratic ego, Sebastian's transition into a starving, silent monk who now actively defied the supreme authority of the crown was not merely an administrative failure. It was an acute, deeply humiliating personal betrayal. The king interpreted Sebastian's silent refusal as a direct, highly visible challenge to his own legitimacy. It highlighted a catastrophic reality. The monarch possessed the absolute capability to dictate the laws of the nation, seize immense territorial wealth, and command heavily armed military units, yet he was fundamentally incapable of commanding the internal thoughts and respect of a man who had intimately known him. To neutralize this psychological threat, the king required more than just the execution of the monk. He required the total, observable submission of Sebastian Newdigate. He needed to systematically break the mental and physical resilience of his former friend to prove that the earthly physical power of the Tudor state superseded any abstract, heavenly devotion. Following their absolute refusal to process the oath, the state immediately activated its penal mechanisms. The physical perimeter of the Charterhouse was permanently breached. Sebastian Newdigate, alongside Houghton, Exmew, and Middlemore, was forcibly extracted from the isolated, rigidly structured monastic environment. Moving Sebastian into the state's penal system marked a brutal shift in Thomas Cromwell's coercion strategy, subjecting him to involuntary, ruthlessly weaponized captivity designed to break his mind. In late May of 1535, the monks were transported to the Marshalsea prison and subsequently transferred to the primary holding facility for high-level state threats, Newgate Prison. The incarceration at Newgate was not designed as a standardized pretrial holding procedure. The Tudor government did not require further investigation or the gathering of forensic evidence. The refusal to swear the oath was an open, legally actionable fact. The function of the incarceration was entirely coercive. The state intended to utilize the physical architecture of the prison, combined with extreme environmental deprivation, to dismantle the psychological resistance of the subjects before they were required to appear in a public courtroom. The central government prepared to deploy a ruthlessly specialized torture protocol against Sebastian Newdigate. The objective was to reduce the highly educated, aristocratically bred scholar into a compliant shell, forcing him to vocalize the required oath and validate the autocrat he had chosen to abandon. In the standard practices of 16th century statecraft, a monarch does not directly interface with a condemned prisoner. The delegation of interrogation and execution to subordinate administrative personnel is a fundamental requirement to maintain the absolute elevation and perceived purity of the sovereign. However, the historical documentation surrounding Sebastian Newdigate's incarceration suggests a severe deviation from this protocol. While held during his initial imprisonment at the Marshalsea prison, according to accounts from his fellow monks, King Henry VIII conducted an intensely direct, covert intervention. Operating under the concealment of physical disguise to bypass public identification, the monarch descended into the state holding facility to personally confront his former gentleman of the Privy Chamber. A forensic analysis of this anomaly reveals the acute psychological vulnerability of the autocratic ego. For King Henry VIII, Sebastian's non-compliance was not a generalized administrative friction. It was a targeted, intimate rejection. The king required the personal validation of the man who had previously managed his private domain. The sovereign's objective was not to interrogate the prisoner. regarding the logistics of a conspiracy, but to execute a high-level psychological extraction, utilizing their previous socio-political intimacy as leverage. The visual data of this encounter presents a stark, unvarnished intersection of absolute power and absolute physical vulnerability. On one side of the prison cell stood the physical embodiment of the English state, heavily capitalized and structurally unassailable. On the opposite side stood the emaciated body of the Carthusian monk, stripped of all aristocratic identifiers and degraded by monastic fasting and prison conditions. The negotiation protocol executed by the king functioned on a strict transactional basis, alternating rapidly between maximum positive reinforcement and maximum threat application. Henry initially deployed the carrot. Utilizing their shared history within the privy chamber, the monarch offered a total instantaneous restoration of societal capital. The king promised the return of immense wealth, territorial assets, and the highest administrative elevations within the newly engineered Church of England. The single required metric of exchange was vocal submission to the oath of supremacy. When Sebastian maintained his mental and verbal refusal, the king's approach immediately snapped. The tactical deployment of prior friendship was instantly replaced by the raw, unmitigated application of state terror. Henry articulated the precise catastrophic legal penalties awaiting the prisoner. The most physically destructive, publicly humiliating execution protocols codified within English common law. Despite the immediate proximity of the sovereign and the absolute certainty of the threat, the subject's deep religious convictions held. Sebastian Newdigate quietly confirmed that his ideological compliance would never be given for state acquisition. The king, having exhausted his psychological leverage and failing to secure the validation his ego demanded, abandoned the prison. This failure triggered an immediate, severe escalation in the state's methodology. Following the king's unsuccessful intervention, Thomas Cromwell reclassified the target. Sebastian Newdigate was no longer a political opponent requiring persuasion. He was an ideological obstacle requiring systematic dismantling. The Privy Council authorized his immediate transfer to Newgate Prison. The selection of Newgate was not arbitrary. It was specifically utilized for the application of advanced coercion techniques. However, the state faced an acutely specific logistical constraint. The central government recognized that the Carthusian monks possessed massive moral capital among the London civilian population. If the state utilized standardized interrogation mechanics, such as the rack or the strappado, the resulting physical trauma, dislocated joints, severed musculature, and massive external hemorrhaging would be blatantly visible during the subsequent public trial. Presenting a visibly mutilated holy man to a civilian jury would risk inducing extreme public sympathy, potentially triggering a rebellion or forcing the jury to return a verdict of acquittal out of sheer moral revulsion. The state required a torture protocol that was infinitely more destructive to the human nervous system than the rack, yet left the external aesthetic of the human body largely intact. To achieve this precise objective, the jailers at Newgate deployed a brutally specialized torturous restraint located within the lowest, unlit masonry infrastructure of the prison. Sebastian was extracted from his holding cell and physically secured to a damp, load-bearing stone pillar. The architecture of his restraint was a masterpiece of ergonomic denial. A thick, rusted iron collar was clamped tightly around his cervical vertebrae, and bolted directly into the stone. A secondary iron band was ratcheted around his abdominal center. His upper extremities were forcibly wrenched behind his back and chained, effectively neutralizing his ability to move his arms, while his lower extremities were secured with heavy iron shackles. This specific configuration was engineered to inflict continuous, inescapable bodily agony. The subject was entombed in a rigidly upright standing position. The strict tolerances of the iron bands ensured that the prisoner's body could not achieve any vector of physical relief. He could not sit, he could not kneel, he could not recline, and he could not lean forward to shift his center of gravity. He was locked into a state of permanent muscular tension. Sebastian Newdigate was chained upright to a pillar for 14 continuous days and nights. This forced standing immediately caused severe blood pooling in his legs. Because he could not walk or move, his circulatory system struggled to pump blood back to his heart against gravity. This complete lack of movement resulted in massive leg swelling and continuous intense nerve pain in his spine and knees. The most dangerous aspect of this torture was how it weaponized his natural need for sleep. Whenever extreme exhaustion forced his brain to shut down, his neck muscles would naturally relax. As his head dropped forward, the heavy iron collar bolted to the pillar would immediately compress his windpipe and major arteries. This mechanical setup choked him the exact moment he fell asleep. This instant choking reflex violently jolted him awake in a constant state of panic. He repeatedly struggled for oxygen against the iron collar, making any true rest completely impossible. Over the course of 2 weeks, this extreme sleep deprivation caused severe mental confusion and intense hallucinations. His mind slowly broke down, losing all sense of time and reality. Simultaneously, his total immobilization created a devastatingly damaging physical environment. Without the ability to move or step away, he was forced to stand continuously in his own accumulating human waste. The acidic nature of this waste rapidly eroded the skin and tissue on his lower legs. This continuous exposure severely accelerated his physical breakdown during the 2-week ordeal. At the same time, his constant involuntary struggles against the restraints caused the rusted iron collar and the wrist manacles to chafe through the skin and underlying connective tissue. In the foul, completely unventilated environment of a 16th century dungeon, these deep friction lacerations immediately developed severe necrotic infections, generating secondary fevers that further accelerated his physical collapse. The tactical objective of this 14-day protocol of physical destruction was not to immediately execute the prisoner. The objective was to force a total psychological capitulation. The state calculated that by subjecting an educated, aristocratically bred subject to extreme sensory deprivation, sleep denial, and absolute physical degradation, his mind would shatter. The state expected the subject to verbally beg for the administration of the oath simply to achieve the cessation of pain and the ability to lie down on the stone floor. The Tudor intelligence apparatus fundamentally miscalculated the resilience of the target. They failed to recognize that Sebastian Newdigate's previous extraction into the London Charterhouse had functioned as a highly specialized, localized conditioning program. For the preceding decade, Sebastian had actively trained his mind to operate independently of his physical comfort. The Carthusian rule had systematically habituated him to prolonged sleep disruption, severe dietary restriction, and continuous tactile distress via the hair shirt. While the state's biological assault at Newgate was exponentially more severe, the subject's internal architecture for processing physical trauma was already extensively developed. Through 14 consecutive days of absolute bodily distress, continuous asphyxiation responses, and necrotic infection, the state apparatus failed to extract a single vocalization of compliance. The body of the former gentleman of the Privy Chamber was reduced to an emaciated, festering shell, yet his unwavering faith remained entirely intact. Recognizing the failure of the coercion protocol, and with the prisoner approaching the absolute limits of viability before death, Thomas Cromwell ordered the termination of this phase of imprisonment. The state was forced to transition the subject from the clandestine environment of Newgate Prison into the prominently visible, meticulously choreographed theater of the public courtroom. The failure of this 14-day campaign of physical destruction within Newgate Prison forced the Tudor administrative apparatus into an exceptionally difficult transition. Thomas Cromwell and the central government recognized that Sebastian Newdigate could not be terminated covertly within his cell. To validate the newly enacted Treason Act of 1534 and permanently establish the absolute ideological supremacy of King Henry VIII, the state required a prominent, highly public conviction. Murder had to be laundered through the established architecture of English jurisprudence. On June 11, 1535, the imprisonment phase was terminated. The state extracted the heavily degraded, emaciated frame of the monk from the unlit masonry of Newgate and transported him to Westminster Hall to face the formal charge of high treason. The visual parameters of the trial at Westminster Hall were engineered to demonstrate the absolute insurmountable power of the central government. The tribunal was populated by the highest-ranking secular and ecclesiastical operators within the Tudor hierarchy, men draped in the heavy silks and furs of state authority, representing the consolidated wealth and military capability of the crown. Standing before this massive institutional apparatus was Sebastian Newdigate, alongside his fellow Carthusian monks, William Exmew and Humphrey Middlemore. Following 2 weeks of continuous, static immobilization, extreme sleep deprivation, and severe physical contamination, Sebastian's physical frame was completely compromised. He was effectively an emaciated skeletal structure covered in the filth of his own captivity. The state calculated that a subject subjected to this level of physical dismantling would be cognitively fractured, incapable of presenting a coherent legal defense, and easily maneuvered into a public capitulation. This calculation fundamentally underestimated the unyielding strength of an intellect heavily fortified by Carthusian discipline. When permitted to enter his plea, Sebastian did not beg for sovereign mercy, nor did he attempt to deny his refusal of the oath of supremacy. Instead, he deployed a brilliantly sophisticated, razor-sharp legal and theological defense that bypassed his physical suffering entirely and directly attacked the foundational legitimacy of the Tudor legal machine. Sebastian argued a precise point of constitutional and natural law. He asserted that a secular statute drafted by an assembly of frightened men in the English Parliament operating under political duress possessed zero jurisdictional authority over the eternal universal laws of the ecclesiastical church. He articulated that forcing a human soul into spiritual submission to a temporal, geographically restricted autocrat was a direct violation of divine hierarchy. He was not merely defending his personal religious beliefs, he was systematically dismantling the Crown's legal argument. He exposed the Act of Supremacy not as a valid legislative function, but as an illegal extra-jurisdictional overreach by a monarch attempting to weaponize theology for personal and dynastic utility. The clarity, intellectual poise, and unyielding sanctity radiating from the condemned men generated an explosively dangerous crisis within the courtroom. The English jury system, comprised of commoners and minor gentry, functioned as a critical variable. These specific jurors still possessed deep, ingrained cultural reverence for the Carthusian order. Confronted with the profound moral conflict of condemning the city's most universally respected holy men, men who had intellectually humiliated the Crown's prosecutors, the jury balked. Their internal moral parameters temporarily overrode their fear of the state. They hesitated, indicating a severe reluctance to return the mandated verdict of guilty. Recognizing the imminent collapse of the legal theater, Thomas Cromwell abandoned all remaining pretense of objective jurisprudence. He recognized that if the jury acquitted the monks, the entire legislative foundation of the king's supremacy would instantly disintegrate. Cromwell physically breached the locked doors of the jury's deliberation room. Utilizing the raw, unmitigated terror generated by the autocratic state, he issued a direct, absolute threat. He informed the jurors that if they failed to deliver the conviction, the Crown would immediately reclassify them as treasonous operatives. They would be arrested, stripped of their assets, and subjected to the exact same termination protocols designed for the monks. The state successfully terrorized its own judicial apparatus into compliance. The jury capitulated, and the mandatory sentence for high treason was formally recorded. On June 19, 1535, Sebastian Newdigate faced his final punishment under the English crown. Tudor executions of high-profile traitors were never meant to be quick or merciful. Instead, they were designed as prolonged spectacles of extreme physical pain and humiliation. The goal was to completely break the condemned man before the public. The state recognized a distinct problem with Sebastian's execution. If he walked proudly to the gallows, the public might view him as a brave religious martyr. To prevent this, the authorities planned a degrading method of transportation. They wanted to strip away his dignity long before he reached the executioner. Guards brought him out of the prison and tied him flat on his back. They strapped him to a hurdle, which was a rough, unpolished panel made of woven wood. This crude sled rested entirely flat against the hard ground. A heavy draft horse was then harnessed to the front of this panel. The horse dragged Sebastian across the rugged streets of 16th century London. The journey to the Tyburn execution grounds covered several miles of difficult terrain. The roads were completely unpaved, deeply rutted, and covered in sharp stones. They were also heavily contaminated with raw sewage and animal waste. As the horse pulled the hurdle, it bounced violently over the uneven ground. This rough transit was designed to scrape and tear his flesh repeatedly. The severe friction caused continuous trauma across his back and limbs. By the time he arrived, he was already heavily bruised and bleeding. Along the route, the state encouraged the local citizens to abuse him. Angry crowds lined the narrow streets to watch the former nobleman pass by. They hurled insults, spat on his injured body, and threw urban garbage at him. This public shaming successfully reduced an aristocratic confidant to a pathetic sight. Upon arriving at Tyburn, Sebastian faced the most brutal punishment available. He was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered by the royal executioner. This method was not meant to bring about a swift death. It was a calculated process of physical dismantling meant to keep him awake. The first stage of the execution began with a controlled hanging. Guards forced Sebastian up a wooden ladder to the execution platform. A heavy hemp rope was secured tightly around his wounded neck. The executioner then pushed him off the ladder to suspend his entire body weight. The executioner carefully calculated the length of the rope's drop. A long drop would snap the neck, causing immediate and painless brain death. The goal here was partial strangulation instead of a quick demise. Sebastian was left to dangle just long enough to induce extreme panic. As his vision darkened from lack of oxygen, the executioner acted quickly. Milliseconds before Sebastian completely lost consciousness, the rope was abruptly cut. He fell heavily to the hard earth below, gasping wildly for air. He was entirely awake, terrified, and fully aware of his surroundings. As the guards pinned him to the ground, the surgical dismantling began. The executioner started by severing the condemned man's genitalia. This brutal act served as a symbolic stripping of his manhood and noble status. The intense trauma sent unimaginable waves of pain through his nervous system. Immediately after, the executioner took a heavy blade to Sebastian's stomach. He made a deep vertical cut straight down the abdominal cavity. While Sebastian remained entirely conscious, the executioner reached inside the open wound. He forcibly ripped out the small and large intestines along with the stomach. The extracted organs were not simply tossed aside by the executioner. They were immediately thrown into a blazing fire pit situated nearby. The pit was deliberately placed directly inside Sebastian's fading line of sight. He was forced to watch his own internal organs burn while he still breathed. Only after this prolonged torture did the executioner deliver the final blow. He reached deep into the upper chest cavity to find the heart. The executioner severed the aorta and physically ripped the heart from the body. Holding the still twitching organ up to the crowd, he finally granted Sebastian death. His legacy was sealed as the crown chopped and preserved his remains. His boiled body parts were nailed to city gates, and his head was spiked. However, this brutal display proved King Henry VIII ultimately failed. The state brutally took his life, but it never broke his silence or conquered his conscience.